Welcome to the Dark Chronicle. Step beyond the surface of history and into the shadows where truth is rarely gentle and the past is never silent. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Let's see how far across the world our witnesses gather as we open another forgotten chapter. She did not become dangerous on the day her family was murdered. That moment did not create something new inside her. It simply stripped away the final illusion that danger could still frighten her. What shifted was not her ability for violence, but her bond with fear itself. Fear had once been her quiet guardian. It shaped her decisions, shortened her stride, taught her when to lower her eyes and when silence was safer than breath. Fear had kept her alive by drawing boundaries around what she dared to risk. But after that day, fear no longer held authority. It had nothing left to bargain with. There was nothing remaining for it to protect. Before the blood and the smoke and the terrible stillness that followed, she had been defined by smaller, ordinary things. The steady rhythm of work from dawn to dusk. A familiar circle of faces that softened the harshness of the world. The fragile comfort of routine. The quiet, almost foolish hope that tomorrow would look enough like today to survive it. That hope died with them, and in its place stood something colder, steadier, and far more dangerous. Her family was not extraordinary in the way history prefers. They were extraordinary in the way survival demands, patient, careful, deeply attuned to one another. They shared what little they had and guarded each other against the constant pressure of a world designed to break them apart. That world never needed a reason. Violence arrived without warning, without ceremony, without justification that mattered. It came the way it always did, disguised as authority, carried by men who believed the right to destroy was woven into their status. Manhunters were not anomalies, they were an extension of the system, outsourced cruelty wrapped in the language of law and property. They moved through land with confidence, knowing their actions would be excused, forgotten, or praised. Her family was in their path that day. What happened was not fast enough to be merciful and not slow enough to allow intervention. It unfolded in fragments that would later replay without sequence, a voice raised too late, a body dropping where it should not have, the sound of breath leaving lungs and not returning. She remembered details she never wanted, angles of light, the smell of dirt, the weight of silence afterward. Trauma does not preserve events cleanly, it preserves sensations. When it was over, the men left as they always did, no urgency, no fear of consequence. They did not look back. To them, this was not a crime, it was an act completed, a task finished, a message delivered. The message was clear and familiar. You are replaceable, your attachments are liabilities, and your grief will not be acknowledged. They underestimated what grief could become. In the hours after, she did not scream. She did not collapse. She moved through the wreckage with an eerie steadiness, tending to bodies that no longer needed tending, touching faces that would never respond again. Shock held her upright, but beneath the shock, something else was forming. Not rage, not madness, but a cold clarity that frightened even her. She understood something then that she had not before. Obedience had always been framed as survival, but survival without anyone left to survive for was an illusion. The system depended on people wanting to live within it. It depended on fear of loss. Her loss had already occurred. The system had taken everything it could. What remained was choice. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Other enslaved people avoided her gaze not out of cruelty but out of instinct. Proximity to grief was dangerous. Grief attracted attention. Attention attracted punishment. Still they helped where they could, bringing water, sharing food, standing nearby without asking questions. No one asked her what she would do next. In a world like this, such questions were not asked aloud. She returned to work because work was expected, because deviation invited scrutiny, because stillness could be mistaken for planning. She became smaller in the ways that mattered, quieter, more compliant. To those watching, it looked like she had broken. That assumption would save her later. Inside, she was not broken. She was emptied. Emptiness is often mistaken for weakness. In truth, it creates space. Space to observe without distraction. Space to remember. Space to calculate. Her grief did not consume her thoughts. It sharpened them. It stripped away everything unnecessary, leaving only what mattered. She began to notice patterns she had never needed to notice before, the way manhunters spoke when they were bored, the way they joked when they felt untouchable, the way they treated places associated with humiliation. Pens, cages, corners as afterthoughts rather than threats. Men who believed themselves hunters rarely imagined being trapped by environments they considered beneath them. The hog pen was one such place. It had always existed on the margins, a site of filth and punishment used to degrade and intimidate. To be thrown into it was to be reminded of one's supposed place in the hierarchy. The men who used it never imagined it as a site of danger. They imagined danger as something that lived in forests, in darkness, in flight, not in containment. She did not think of the pen as a weapon at first. She thought of it as a symbol, a reminder of how power expressed itself casually without thought, that casualness would become its weakness. She carried her grief quietly, never speaking her family's names aloud. Names carried power, and power invited theft. She spoke to them only in her mind, rehearsing their faces until they felt carved into her memory. She promised nothing. Promises were fragile. She allowed the idea of vengeance to form without forcing it into shape. Vengeance is often portrayed as explosive, reckless, consuming. What grew in her was none of those things. It was methodical. It did not demand immediate release. It demanded patience, the kind of patience learned by people who had spent their lives waiting for moments others never noticed. She knew she could not act alone, not directly, not openly. The system was too vast. But systems are not monoliths. They are collections of habits, routines, assumptions, and habits create openings. Her family's murder had not made her reckless. It had made her precise. She learned to smile when spoken to nod at jokes she did not hear, to remain forgettable. Men remember resistance. They rarely remember compliance. That forgettability was not surrender. It was camouflage. At night, she replayed the day over and over, not to punish herself but to extract information. Who stood where? Who moved first? Who hesitated? Who laughed afterward? These details mattered, not for memory but for mapping. She understood something else too. Revenge that merely killed would not be enough. Death was cheap in this world. It happened daily. The men who murdered her family were accustomed to death. What they were not accustomed to was reversal, to being treated as disposable, to being reduced to bodies in a place designed to strip dignity. What she would eventually do would not be framed as justice by any law that existed. She accepted that laws had never protected her family. They would not protect her now. Her concern was not legality, it was meaning. The system had tried to teach her that she was powerless, that her pain was irrelevant, that her family's lives were footnotes. She would respond not with noise but with certainty. For now she waited. Waiting was not passive. It was active restraint. It was learning when not to move. It was allowing men to believe they had won. That terror had done its work. Terror only works when it succeeds in its goal. In her it had failed. The woman they believed had been broken was in fact no longer bound by the rules they relied on. They had taken her family. They had not taken her attention. They had not taken her patience. And they had not taken her ability to see the world as it truly was, full of small, overlooked spaces where power assumed safety and found none. The moment her life broke was the moment fear stopped guiding her. Everything that followed would grow from the absence. To the people who watched her afterward, nothing about her suggested danger. That was the most useful thing about her. In a world trained to scan constantly for threats, she registered as none. She was quiet in a way that did not draw curiosity, obedient in a way that did not invite attention. Her grief appeared to have folded inward, contained, domesticated. Men mistook that containment for defeat. They were accustomed to measuring people quickly. Strength was obvious. Defiance was loud. Fear announced itself in posture and voice. Those who planned escape or rebellion often revealed themselves through impatience, through glances held too long, through anger that refused to stay hidden. She did none of that. She worked, spoke when spoken to, lowered her eyes when required. To men who believed control was absolute, she appeared controlled. What they failed to understand was that compliance and submission are not the same thing. Submission surrenders intent. Compliance preserves it. She learned early that attention was a currency she could not afford. When eyes lingered on her, she made herself smaller. When questions came, she answered simply. When jokes were made at her expense, she allowed a faint smile to pass across her face. That smile cost her nothing. It bought her invisibility. Invisibility is not absence, it is positioning. Men rarely studied those they believed incapable of action. They spoke freely around her. They complained, boasted, laughed. They assumed she absorbed nothing. That assumption was one of the system's oldest weaknesses. It relied on the belief that those without power lacked perception. She listened without appearing to. She remembered without reacting. Her work brought her into spaces others avoided: filthy corners, pens, storage areas, places associated with punishment rather than planning. These places were dismissed as beneath consideration. That dismissal allowed her to move through them unobserved. She learned how structures were maintained, how locks worked, how animals were handled, where keys were kept, where shortcuts existed. No one questioned her presence. She belonged to the margins. Margins are where patterns are most visible. The men who hunted people carry themselves with casual cruelty. They joked about their work because joking made it lighter. Humor softened the weight of what they did. They referred to their targets as animals, not to hide the truth, but to justify it. In their minds, hunting was sport, and sport required detachment. She noticed how they relaxed after success, how vigilance faded when they believed danger had passed, how arrogance crept in when no consequences followed their actions. These men did not fear retaliation. Retaliation required organization, resources, courage. They believed none of those existed among the people they terrorized. They never considered grief as a resource. She did not move with haste. She did not let emotion rush her into error. Every day she survived added to her understanding. Every careless word spoken in her presence became data. She learned who led and who followed, who hesitated and who enjoyed cruelty, who drank too much, who wandered alone. She learned which men trusted each other and which merely tolerated one another. The hunters had routines. They believed routines made them efficient. Routines also made them predictable. She watched how they treated spaces meant for animals. Pens were places of filth, noise, and containment. They were not seen as threats. Men stepped into them without caution. Sometimes drunk, sometimes careless, sometimes mocking those forced inside. They did not imagine those spaces as sites of reversal. Power blinds imagination. The hog pen in particular held a symbolic weight. It was a place of degradation used to remind people of how little their suffering mattered. To be associated with it was to be stripped of dignity. The men who used it never imagined themselves inside it. Hierarchies collapse when symbols are inverted. She understood this instinctively, though she never named it as such. Others noticed her quietness and mistook it for fragility. Some pied her, some avoided her. A few whispered that she had gone numb. None suspected calculation. Numbness is often misunderstood. In truth, it can be clarity without interference. At night, she slept lightly, not from fear, but from habit. Her mind continued to assemble fragments into patterns. She tested possibilities silently, discarding those that relied on luck or mercy. Luck was unreliable, mercy non-existent. Whatever she did would need to succeed through certainty, not chance. She did not speak of her family. Speaking would have given others a way to frame her grief, to reduce it to a story they could manage. She kept it private, internal, unassailable. The faces of those she lost did not haunt her in the way trauma is often described. They accompanied her, they studied her. They reminded her why hesitation was a luxury she no longer possessed. Men continued to underestimate her because underestimation was built into the system. They believed power flowed in one direction only. They believed intelligence followed status. They believed those who endured punishment would eventually accept it. That belief was necessary for their own peace of mind. She allowed them to keep it. When they looked at her, they saw a woman shaped by loss into something smaller. They did not see what loss had removed. Fear of punishment, fear of death, fear of consequence. These fears were the levers by which control operated. Without them, the system was grip weakened. She understood that vengeance carried risks not only to herself, but to others. She did not romanticize her intent. She did not imagine herself as a hero. She saw herself as someone who no longer accepted the rules imposed upon her. That distinction mattered. Heroes act for recognition. She acted for resolution. Her plan, still unformed, was guided by a single principle: reversal. Not escape, not confrontation, reversal. The hunters would experience, if only briefly, what they inflicted daily. Panic, disorientation, the sudden realization that the world they controlled no longer responded to them. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was clarity imposed upon those who refused to see. She remained patient because patience had been forced upon her all her life. Now she wielded it deliberately. She allowed time to dull suspicion, to restore routines, to lull confidence. The men returned to their habits. They drank. They joked. They moved through spaces without caution. They believed the moment of violence had passed. Violence had not passed. It had transformed. She did not rush, because rushing would have meant acting on emotion rather than strategy. Emotion can inspire action, but it rarely sustains precision. Precision was what she required. To the world around her, she faded into background noise. That fading was intentional. It was preparation. The woman they misjudged was not invisible because she lacked substance. She was invisible because she had learned exactly how little she needed to show. By the time they noticed her again, if they noticed her at all, it would be far too late to reconsider what they thought they knew about her. Their greatest mistake was believing that grief only breaks. They never considered what grief can build when it has nothing left to lose. She began to understand the hunters not as monsters but as patterns. Monsters invite fear, patterns invite prediction. Prediction is power. The men who hunted people did not imagine themselves studied. They believed observation flowed in one direction only. They watched the land, tracked footprints, rid broken branches and bent grass. They did not consider that they themselves left traces just as visible. Their confidence made them careless. Carelessness repeated becomes routine. Routine becomes vulnerability. She learned their habits the way one learns, whether not by confronting it but by noticing cycles. When they woke, when they drank, when they boosted, when their attention sharpened, and when it dulled. She learned which men trusted instinct over planning, which followed orders without thinking, which needed to be seen as leaders, and which hid behind louder voices. These distinctions mattered more than weapons. The hunters moved in groups, but they were not unified. They were bound by purpose, not loyalty. Each man carried his own version of courage, and many carried fear masked as bravado. She learned which jokes were repeated because they reassured the teller, which insults were directed downward to reassert hierarchy, which silences meant uncertainty. Men revealed themselves most when they believed no one is listening. She was always listening. She learned that success made them sloppy. After a hunt went well, vigilance relaxed, rules bent, alcohol flowed. Theories were exaggerated. They laughed louder, wandered farther, took shortcuts they would never risk when sober or cautious. Confidence erased discipline. Discipline was the only thing that ever protected them. She noticed how they treated the land. They believed ownership meant dominance. They cut paths straight instead of winding, ignored natural warnings, trampled through areas they did not need to. This made them efficient, but it also made them predictable. They moved like men who had never needed to hide. She learned their favorite gathering spots, places where they felt safe enough to let guard down. Areas close to structures, pens, familiar landmarks. They avoided deep woods at night, not out of fear but inconvenience. Danger to them lived where effort was required. They preferred places already claimed by human control. The Hoppen sat firmly in that category. It was not a place of honor. It was a place of humiliation, a place used to remind others of their status. The hunters treated it as background scenery, not as environment. They stepped into it without looking down, laughed while doing so, wiped filth from boots with annoyance rather than caution. They never imagined it as a space where the balance could shift. She paid attention to how it was built, how boards were reinforced in some places and weakened in others, how gates latched, how sound traveled inside it, how animals reacted when trapped there. Pens are designed to contain, not protect. They work equally well on anything inside them. She noticed which men were willing to step into confined spaces and which hesitated. Some laughed louder when enclosed, masking discomfort. Others moved quickly, eager to exit. Claustrophobia, impatience, overconfidence. These were as useful as physical weakness. She learned how the hunters coordinated or failed to. They relied on assumed roles. One man always took charge, even when his judgment faltered. Others deferred out of habit. When leadership is assumed rather than earned, it becomes brittle, removes certainty, and confusion spreads faster than fear. She did not test them. Testing invited exposure. Instead, she collected information quietly, letting it accumulate until patterns became clear enough to trust. She did not need to know everything. She needed to know enough. She watched how they responded to inconvenience. Small frustrations irritated them disproportionately. A stuck gate, a misplaced tool, a delayed meal. These moments revealed temper and impulse control. Men who respond poorly to minor disruption rarely respond well to crisis. She noticed how they handled animals. Dogs were tools to them, extensions of will rather than partners. When dogs obeyed, they praised dominance. When dogs hesitated, they punished confusion. They did not understand the difference between command and trust. This mattered. Dogs trained through fear behave differently when fear shifts direction. She learned which men drank heavily, which drank to forget, which drank to perform courage. Alcohol did not make them weaker in obvious ways. It made them louder, less observant, more convinced of their own invulnerability. They believed danger was something that happened to others. She learned how they spoke about the people they hunted. Language revealed mindset. They did not speak of individuals, they spoke of bodies, numbers, obstacles. This abstraction made violence easier, but it also made them inattentive. When you stop seeing people as people, you stop anticipating intelligence. They never anticipated hers. She did not imagine herself clever than them in some grand sense. She understood something simpler. She cared more. They hunted because it was their job, their income, their sport. She planned because she had lost everything that made obedience meaningful. Motivation sharpens focus in ways training cannot. As days turned into weeks, she mapped not only behavior but timing, which men moved together, which separated, which returned late, which lingered after others left. Opportunity is rarely created. It reveals itself when observation meets patience. She did not hurry the moment. She let it come to her. She understood that 5 men together were different from 5 men isolated in a confined, unfamiliar situation. Power relies on space. Space to move, to assert, to retreat. Remove space and power collapses inward. Panic fills the gap. She thought often of the hogpen not as a place, but as an idea. It was designed to strip dignity, to overwhelm senses, to create chaos. It was meant to break those inside it psychologically before any physical harm occurred. She recognized its potential because she understood humiliation as a weapon. What the hunters never realized was that the tools of oppression are neutral. They do not belong inherently to those who wield them first. In the right hands, they can be turned. She did not plan violence for spectacle. She planned it for message. The message was not meant for the hunters alone. It was meant for anyone who believed power was permanent and unchallenged. It was meant to fracture certainty. She knew that what she intended would ripple outward. Consequences would follow. The system would respond with greater cruelty, tighter control, harsher punishments. She weighed this carefully. Her choice was not reckless. It was informed by the knowledge that restraint had never protected anyone she loved. She prepared herself mentally for outcomes she could not control. She accepted that she might not survive. Survival was no longer her metric. Meaning was she waited for the conditions to align. The right combination of arrogance, routine, and neglect. The hunters provided it themselves. They always did. The night she sensed the moment approaching, nothing dramatic occurred. No sign announced it. That is how true opportunity feels, not loud but inevitable. The men joked as usual. They moved as usual. They believed the world remained unchanged. Only she knew that the balance had shifted. The hunters believed they understood the land. They believed they understood fear. They believed they understood the people they hunted. What they had never learned was how it felt to be studied by someone who had already lost everything that could be taken. They did not realize that the habits they relied on had been observed, catalogued, and patiently folded into a design they would not recognize until it closed around them. By the time they understood that they were no longer the hunters, the realization would arrive not as insight but as panic. And panic in confined spaces is unforgiving. Everything was red. All that remained was the moment when certainty would finally betray them. The hog pen had never been meant to hold men. That was why it would work. It existed on the edges of daily life, a structure people avoided looking at directly. Filth clung to it. Noise rose from it at inconvenient hours. The smell lingered no matter how often it was cleaned. It was a place associated with punishment, not planning, and because of that, it was never treated with respect. Men stepped into it carelessly, assuming the environment itself was already conquered. She saw it differently. Where they saw degradation, she saw containment. Where they saw something beneath them, she saw a structure designed to strip power quickly and efficiently. Pens are built to control bodies through confusion, tight spaces, uneven footing, limited sight lines, overwhelming sensory input. Animals panic in them because panic is the point. Panic makes control easier for the one standing outside. She imagined what would happen if the roles were reversed. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It emerged gradually, shaped by observation rather than impulse. She tested it in her mind the way a carpenter tests measurements before cutting wood. Where would sound echo? Where would movement bottleneck? Which boards held weight, which rattled? Which could be secured quickly? She watched hogs react when gates closed suddenly. She noticed how quickly noise turned to chaos, how instinct overrode coordination. Men were not so different. She learned when the pen was most neglected. Late evenings after drinking, times when the men used it not for work, but for mockery, for humiliation, for entertainment. They treated it as a stage, not a trap. That arrogance would be their undoing. She did not need weapons in the traditional sense. Weapons would draw attention. Weapons required confrontation. She needed leverage, not force. The pen itself would provide that. Preparation did not look like preparation. It looked like routine. She cleaned where she was told. She carried feed. She mended when ordered. In doing so, she familiarized herself with the structure in ways no one questioned. She knew how long it took to secure a gate if one moved with intention. She knew which latches stuck and which slid easily. She knew how many steps it took to reach the outer posts. She learned how men behaved when they felt entertained. When cruelty became amusement, vigilance vanished. They leaned against fences. They joked. They stepped inside spaces they would never enter sober or serious. Power, when indulged, forgets caution. She did not intend to lure them in with words. Words could fail. She intended to let their own habits carry them exactly where she needed them to be. Timing mattered more than strength. She waited for a night when the group would be together, when alcohol dulled edges and familiarity bred recklessness. She waited for laughter to replace discipline. The hunters themselves provided the conditions. They always did. The evening arrived without drama, no signs, no omens. Men laughed, drank, moved freely. The world to them felt predictable. They believed danger had been removed long ago. They believed fear lived elsewhere. She moved as she always did. Nothing in her posture signaled intent. Her calm was not an act. It was the absence of fear she had lived with since the day her family died. Fear would have been the unnatural thing. The moment unfolded quickly, but not suddenly. The first man stepped into the pan because he always did. Another followed, joking, careless. A third lingered near the gate, distracted. The space filled with bodies and noise. The smell was overwhelming but familiar. They laughed louder to drown it out. She acted only when certainty tipped into complacency. The gate closed with a sound they did not recognize as danger at first. Gates closed all the time. It took seconds for understanding to catch up. Seconds are enough. By the time they turned, the space had already changed. What had felt open now felt narrow. What had felt controllable now resisted movement. Their footing slipped. Their voices collided with one another. Confusion spread faster than coordination ever could. She did not shout. She did not taunt. She did not announce herself. She moved with speed born of preparation, securing Clear's throat what needed securing, stepping back into shadow before panic fully bloomed. The pen did the rest. Inside, hierarchy collapsed immediately. Men who gave orders found no one listening. Men who followed found no clear direction. Panic does not respect rank. It amplifies instinct. Bodies pressed together, voices rose. The space magnified every sound, every movement, every misstep. They tried to force the gate. It resisted. They tried to climb. Boards cut hands and broke grip. The smell, the noise, the proximity overwhelmed thought. The men who had thrived on domination now experienced what they had inflicted countless times, helplessness. She did not remain to watch. Watching would have been indulgence. Indulgence invites error. She had no desire to savor their suffering. That was not the point. The point was reversal. The point was clarity. Outside the pen, the night returned to its ordinary rhythm. Insects buzzed. The land did not react. Violence, when contained, does not announce itself to the world. It happens in pockets unnoticed until it is too late. What happened inside the pen unfolded without her intervention. Panic is efficient. Confined spaces strip coordination. Men turned on one another not out of malice but out of desperation. Each movement made things worse. Each attempt to assert control increased chaos. They had never learned how to function. Without space, without authority, without the ability to retreat. They were trapped, not just physically but psychologically. They could not imagine themselves as prey. That imagination failure was fatal. By the time sound drew attention from afar, the situation had already passed the point of resolution. People would later speculate. They would frame it as accident, as misfortune, as an inexplicable event. Explanations would be crafted to preserve the illusion of order. No one would frame it as design. She moved through the aftermath like a ghost. The same invisibility that had protected her before now allowed her to disappear into routine once more. She did not boast. She did not confess. Confession would have been meaningless. The act did not belong to language. It belonged to consequence. The hog pen, once a symbol of humiliation imposed, now carried a different weight. People avoided it more deliberately. They spoke of it in lowered voices. The men who had used it so casually were gone, removed not by superior force, but by the environment they had never respected. Authority responded, as it always does, to loss with control, to uncertainty with violence. Questions were asked, accusations floated, punishments increased. But without a visible enemy, the system turned inward, tightening itself into knots. Her role was never proven. It did not need to be. Proof is a luxury of those who control narrative. She controlled only outcome. Among the enslaved, the story traveled carefully. It did not travel as celebration. Celebration attracts attention. It traveled as warning and reassurance intertwined, a reminder that intelligence had not been extinguished, that even the most degrading tools could be repurposed. That power was not as absolute as it pretended to be. She did not see herself as an avenger in the way stories later framed her. She did not believe she had balanced any cosmic scale. Her family remained dead. Nothing could undo that. What she had done did not bring peace. It brought resolution. The men who believed themselves untouchable had been touched by the consequences of their own cruelty. That knowledge mattered not because it changed the world overnight, but because it cracked certainty. Certainty is the foundation of oppression. Once it fractures, fear shifts direction. She carried that knowledge with her afterward wherever she went. It did not make her reckless. It did not make her loud. It made her aware of how fragile systems truly are when confronted by someone who no longer believes in their permanence. The Hogpen returned to its place on the margins, but it was no longer invisible. It had revealed something the men never intended, that structures designed to dehumanize can become instruments of reckoning when seen clearly. She had not turned herself into a weapon. She had turned their assumptions against them. What followed would not be written cleanly. Names would blur, details would shift. The system would ensure that. But beneath the distortion, one truth remained intact. Control had failed in the place at least expected to. And it had failed because someone learned to see the world exactly as it was, and chose to act within it without fear. The night control collapsed did not arrive with thunder or warning. It arrived the way most irreversible moments do, quietly, wrapped in normally, unnoticed until it had already passed the point of correction. Those who would later try to explain what happened struggled because they searched for spectacle. They imagined a struggle, a fight, a dramatic confrontation. There was none. What unfolded was not chaos introduced from outside, but chaos released from within. The hunters did not fall because they were attacked. They fell because the structure that had always protected them failed, and they did not know how to exist without it. Inside the pen, panic took shape faster than thought. At first it was disbelief. Men laughed, assuming the gate had closed accidentally. They pushed at it with casual force, still operating under the assumption that the world would correct itself. When it did not, irritation replaced humor. Irritation escalated into urgency. Urgency dissolved into fear. Fear does not announce itself politely. It scrambles priorities. It breaks alliances. It turns coordination into collision. The space they had never respected now dictated everything. Sound bounced back at them, amplifying shouts until they blurred into noise. Bodies pressed together, each man instinctively trying to claim space that no longer existed. Footing slipped on filth they had never bothered to notice. The pen did what it had always been designed to do. It overwhelmed. Orders were shouted, but no one listened. Leadership requires trust, and trust evaporates under panic. The men who had relied on authority found their voices lost in the den. The men who followed found no clear direction. Each movement worsened the situation. Each attempt to force an exit created new obstacles. Outside the pen, the world remained indifferent. No alarms rang. Clear's throat, no immediate rescue arrived. The men had never planned for this scenario because they had never imagined themselves vulnerable. Vulnerability requires imagination. They had none inside. Time became distorted. Minutes stretched, collapsed, overlapped. Pain blurred into confusion. Fear fed on itself. The men were not undone by a single decisive act, but by accumulation of panic, of missteps, of bodies moving without coordination. The environment they had used to humiliate others now stripped them of dignity with equal efficiency. There was a moment, there is always a moment, when realization arrived. Not realization of who had done this, but of what it meant. The sudden understanding that they were experiencing the very condition they had imposed on others countless times. That understanding did not bring reflection. It brought terror. Terror is not educational in the moment. It is only overwhelming. By the time sound carried beyond the pen in a way that registered as concern rather than background noise, intervention was already too late. Whatever could have been done earlier required calm, coordination, and humility. None were present. When people arrived, they arrived into aftermath. What they found defied easy explanation. There were no signs of attack from outside, no weapons, no clear evidence of sabotage. The pen stood intact, doing exactly what it had always been meant to do. The men inside were dead or dying, not from a single blow, but from the compounded effects of panic and confinement. Authority hates ambiguity. Ambiguity suggests limits. Immediate efforts were made to control the narrative. Words like accident surfaced quickly. Accidents preserve the illusion that no one is responsible. Accidents do not require reckoning, but the explanations rang hollow even to those offering them. Too many details refused to align cleanly. Too many questions lingered. Whispers began almost immediately. Among the enslaved, the news traveled differently. It did not arrive as triumph. It arrived as shock, then disbelief, then a careful, measured understanding of what it meant. People did not celebrate openly. Celebration would have been dangerous. Instead, they absorbed the story quietly, fitting it into an internal map of what was possible. The most unsettling part was not that 5 hunters were dead. Death was familiar. The unsettling part was how it had happened. Without weapons, without open rebellion, without spectacle, the system had failed itself. Authority responded predictably. Surveillance increased. Rules tightened. Punishments grew harsher. The system lashed out blindly. As systems do when shaken, it searched for an enemy it could see. It could not find one. She was questioned as many were. Her answers were simple, consistent, unremarkable. She showed no signs of guilt because guilt would have implied wrongdoing within a moral framework she no longer recognized. She showed no signs of pride because pride would have drawn attention. She remained exactly as she had been: small, quiet, compliant. That consistency saved her. Those who interrogated her looked for cracks. They looked for fear, for agitation, for slips. They did not find them. What they mistook for emptiness was restraint. What they mistook for obedience was calculation. No proof ever emerged. Proof would have required the men to imagine that someone they dismissed as powerless could design their undoing. That imagination threatened the entire hierarchy. It was safer to believe in accident than in intelligence where they had never acknowledged it before. The Hogben was avoided afterward. Not officially condemned, not removed, just left alone. Places associated with unexplained failure tend to be abandoned quietly. People do not like reminders of vulnerability. The men who remained altered their behavior, though none would admit it. They moved with less ease. They laughed less freely. They avoided enclosed spaces they once entered without thought. Fear had changed direction. She observed all of this without reaction. Her role was finished. The act itself had been only one part of a larger outcome. The true consequence was not death, but disruption. Certainty had cracked. The belief that power flowed in only one direction had been challenged. She did not feel relief. Relief suggests an end. This was not an end. It was a shift. Her family was still gone. That absence did not soften. But something else had been introduced into the world. A quiet, undeniable proof that the system was not invulnerable. That intelligence, patience, and clarity could still operate within even the most brutal constraints. She did not claim the act as hers, even in her own mind, claiming it would have made it about identity. She understood it as a response, not a statement, a consequence, not a performance. What mattered was not that she had trapped 5 men. What mattered was that the men who hunted others had experienced, however briefly, the condition they believed belonged only to those beneath them. That knowledge could not be erased. Even if the story was distorted, the night control collapse did not end oppression. It did not ignite revolution. It did something quieter, and in its own way more dangerous. It introduced doubt. And doubt once planted does not require constant tending. It grows in silence, reshaping behavior long after the moment that created it has been buried. She returned to her life as it had always appeared from the outside: work, silence, survival. But the world around her was no longer quite the same. Neither were the people who believed they owned it. What followed was not justice in any official sense. There were no trials, no acknowledgments, no written admissions that the system had failed itself. What followed was erasure, careful, deliberate, methodical, the kind of erasure designed not to correct the past, but to protect the future of those in power. Records were adjusted quietly, names appeared briefly and then disappeared, accounts conflicted just enough to blur responsibility. The deaths of the hunters were folded into language that neutralized meaning: misfortune, disorder, an unfortunate incident. The fewer details that survived, the easier it became to move on without explanation. Authority prefers silence over truth when truth threatens structure. The woman did not remain where she was forever. People like her rarely do. Movement was common in those days, especially when attention lingered too long in one place. Whether she was sold, transferred, or slipped away through circumstances no one recorded is impossible to know. The system ensured that certainty was replaced with ambiguity. Ambiguity protects power. What did not disappear, however, was memory. Among the enslaved, the story endured, carefully reshaped to survive. It was not told as a tale of triumph. Triumph invites retaliation. It was told as a lesson, as a reminder that intelligence did not belong exclusively to those who claimed it. That humiliation could be reversed, that even the most degrading tools, when understood clearly, could be turned back on those who relied on them. The story changed with each telling, as such stories always do. Details softened, names were removed, locations shifted. What remained constant was the core truth. The hunters had become trapped, not by superior force, but by their own assumptions. The system had been made to confront itself, if only briefly. For the woman herself, there was no celebration. There was no sense of victory that erased loss. Her family remained dead. Nothing could return them. What she carried forward was not pride but resolve. She had acted not because she believed the world would change, but because she refused to let it remain unchallenged. She understood that acts like hers did not dismantle systems. They exposed them. The consequences rippled outward in subtle ways. Men grew more cautious, though they would never admit why. Enclosed spaces were treated differently. Laughter was tempered by awareness. A faint hesitation crept into places where none had existed before. These changes were small, but systems depend on the illusion of inevitability. Once that illusion fractures, even slightly, it never fully repairs. The hogpen itself became an unspoken landmark, not avoided officially but sidestepped instinctively. People do not like places where certainty died. They do not like reminders that power can fail in ways that defy explanation. No songs were written about her. No monuments raised. Those who survive under oppression rarely receive such recognition. Their victories must remain quiet to remain alive. Her legacy was not carved in stone. It lived in posture, in caution, in the way people learned to look twice at spaces they had once dismissed. Her story did not end oppression. It did not ignite rebellion. It did not rewrite laws. What it did was more dangerous than that. It proved possibility. Possibility does not need numbers. It does not need organization. It does not even need repetition. It clears throat, needs only to exist once clearly enough that it cannot be fully denied. Once people know something can happen, they cannot unknow it. That knowledge survived long after her name was forgotten. It survived in the understanding that obedience is often a performance, not a truth. That compliance can conceal intent. That systems built on fear are strongest only as long as fear remains intact. When fear collapses, even briefly, control becomes brittle. The woman who trapped 5-man hunters did not see herself as exceptional. She saw herself as someone pushed beyond the point where restraint served any purpose. Her action was not born of rage but of clarity. Clarity is dangerous because it strips away illusions without replacing them with comfort. History, when it did acknowledge the event at all, distorted it. Some versions blamed animals, others blamed negligence. Some framed it as an accident so improbable it bordered on myth. These explanations were not meant to inform, they were meant to close the case. But among those who lived close enough to the truth to feel its impact, the case was never closed. The lesson endured quietly. Power is not omniscient. It does not see everything. It overlooks what it believes beneath it. And in those overlooked spaces, intelligence sweats. The woman disappeared into that truth, carrying with her the knowledge that she had done what she could with the world as it was. She did not expect gratitude. She did not expect recognition. She expected consequences, and she accepted them. What she left behind was not a story of violence but a fact.